So let's just quickly go and have a look at our next questions. The next questions that we received was from Sharon. Now, once again, I started with these settlement questions because they're quite important. We were supposed to start off the term with settlement. And if we quickly have a look at this diagram, immediately I can identify a rural settlement. Now, grade 12s, how did I basically manage to do this? Now, first of all, let's go and identify the keys that's been provided on this diagram. First of all, there's the term farm and farm boundaries. Now, we have contour lines situated over here. Now, contour lines, what is contour lines? It's lines joining places with equal height. We've got a river situated over here. Let me just get a blue pen to indicate it on here. So we've got a river situated over there. The dots in these keys represents the actual farms. So all along, we've got farms over here, isolated farmsteads. So it's actually the house on the farms. Now, as you can see over here, we have a bunch of homesteads all together. As you can see, there's some farms situated over there. And the key provided us with the farm boundaries as well, showing us the different types of farms. Now, first of all, rural settlements, how do we identify them? Very importantly, I just want to use a different color pen. It's usually primary activities. We focus on primary activities in rural settlements. For instance, fishing, farming, forestry, and mining. Now, in the case on our diagram, we basically, as you can see, which primary activity can we identify over here, and it's definitely farming. Now, pay attention to the letter A. Now, first of all, immediately, if you look at your concepts regarding rural settlements, A is a dispersed settlement. What does dispersed mean? Far from another. Because there's one settlement, there's the next one. As you can see, they're quite far away from one another. If we look at settlement D, there's a bunch of houses close to one another. We say it's a nucleated settlement. Now, very importantly, there's a reason why people tend to be nucleated or dispersed. Now, once again, we can go and look at the different types of farming that takes place. By now, you should know we've got two different types of farming taking place in South Africa. We've got commercial farming and we have subsistence farming. Now, commercial farming, keep this in mind, is there to make a profit, is to make money. And subsistence farming is basically just to provide for yourself and for your family. So commercial farming might be intensive and extensive, where subsistence farming might be a little bit of everything, because you only need to provide for your own family. But many factors can also contribute to farms being dispersed as well as nucleated. And these factors, we call it the site of a settlement. Now, very importantly, I haven't mentioned this before. What is a settlement? It's where people live. So why do people choose to go and live in certain areas? Now, for example, when we look at this diagram, I can guarantee you the farmers at the letter A, they probably settled over there because if you look at the site, there might be very fertile soil, they have access to water, and it might be they experience a very good climate, for instance, a high rainfall to be able to irrigate their farmland. So let's go back to the diagram quickly. So definitely if we look at A and B, they have access to the river. But more importantly, if we go to letter B, there's a road. Now keep in mind, I just want to use the red pen over here. There's a road. Now if you look at these farms, they are situated in a linear pattern. What's a linear pattern? All in a row. Now linear patterns usually develop next to rivers, as you can see on the diagram, or next to a road. Now if you think of products that's being produced by farmers, it's usually perishable. What does perishable means? It means they can go off. For instance, the farmers at area B might be farming perishable goods such as tomatoes, bananas. So it gives them access close to major transport routes to be able to get their product to the market. Now, if we look at settlement A, for example, they are situated next to a river. So the river can provide them for water for irrigation purposes to be able to make their product grow. Now, D is a very interesting scenario that we have over here. Once again, we need to go back and focus on our key that's been represented over here. As you can see, the key that's been represented over here is known as a water source. Now, as you can see, that this nucleated settlement are focused to stay around the water source. Now, what we've learned in settlements, we have wet point settlements and dry point settlements. Now, the best possible way to explain this to you, I want you to have a look at dry point. Let's start with dry point settlements. Think of it this way. You need to be able to stay dry. So when people nucleate together, settlements nucleate together, and usually on high-lying areas such as C, that is definitely a dry point settlement, because as you can see, they are quite far away from the river, and it's basically, in case the river goes into flood, it's a dry point settlement, furthest away from the river. But if you look at a wet point settlement is when a settlement becomes nucleated, because water might be a very scarce resource. So what does the settlement tend to do? They become nucleated because they want to live close to the water resource to be able to help them with irrigation and to provide them with their needs. So that's the difference between a wet point and a dry point settlement. Let's just go over it again, because it's quite important, and these questions do come up quite often in our examination papers. A dry point settlement is usually at a high-lying area to keep dry, for instance during flooding. A wet point settlement is usually when people nucleate it, settlements nucleate around a water source to be able to provide them with water. So we can almost say that the water is scarce. Pay attention to settlement C. As you can see, look at the contour lines. What do we know about contour lines? Let's just quickly revise a little bit of map work while we're at it. Now, if you just extend the page, what do we know about contour lines? If the contour lines are close to one another, we know it's a steep gradient. If the contour lines are far from one another, we know it's a gentle gradient. Okay, so if we go back to that image, as you can see, the contour lines are very close to one another. So we might experience we definitely experiencing a steep gradient over there. Okay, but now that's the beauty, once again, grade 12s, we haven't even looked at the questions. And we just basically deciphered this image by just looking at all of the keys that's been provided and the scenario that's being provided. Now, if you look at question 1.4.1, identify pattern or settlement pattern D. Now, let's just quickly have a look at D. There's D, as you can see, the settlements is the farmsteads. They're all together next to a water resource. What do we know? It's a nucleated settlement. So let's just go and write it down there at the bottom of the page. First answer, it's a nucleated settlement. Okay, and we distinguished between the different types of settlements we have. We have nucleated, when they're too close together, and we have dispersed when they far from one another. If we quickly look at our next question, which you regard D, a wet or a dry point settlement? Now, once again, we've answered this question by just looking at the diagram. D, as you can see, the settlement surrounds a water resource. Now, which is it? Is it a wet point or a dry point? Definitely a wet point settlement, because they gather around a water resource such as a borehole or a dam. And if you look at C, for instance, is a dry point settlement, far away because they want to stay dry. Easy way to remember this. Okay, provide a reason for your answer. I've basically answered question 1.4.2 or 1.4.3 a couple of seconds ago. It's a wet point settlement because all the settlements are nucleated around it. Now, if we look at mention the factors that influence the site of settlement B. Now, if you look at settlement B, I've mentioned this before. Now, first of all, I think B is very well settled there. Because first of all, the site, as you can see, they have a river flowing there. So immediately, B is not going to experience problems with irrigation because they have a river system that provides them with water. And secondly, they have a road. So it gives them great access to be able to take their goods and transport them. And if you look at the pattern, it's a linear pattern because all these farmsteads is like in a row. So if we want to answer our question, let's go back to the question. Okay, what influences the site of settlement B? Definitely, I'm going to say access to the road, as well access to the river for irrigation purposes. Okay, so actually a very, very good site for settlement B. If we go back to our questions quickly, mention the physical factor that influenced the activity in farms A and D. Now physical, let's just quickly go and have a look at physical. What's physical? A and D, what's the physical factor? Now first of all, the physical factors, if you look at the topography, as you can see, the contour lines, there's no contour lines over here. So it's definitely a flat area. So it makes farming much easier in comparison to the settlement at sea where it's extremely steep. So the physical factor over there for D and A is two things. There's water and flat land. There's water as well as flat land. That makes the farming activity much easier. If we quickly have a look at our next question, is there a difference in climates of settlement A and C? I absolutely love this question because now when we look at this question, what we basically do is we have a look at local climate, and when we learn about local climate, we looked at valley climates. Now immediately I want you to go back to our diagram. What do we know? C is situated on a very steep gradient. So let's quickly assume I need to go and construct a cross-section from C to A. Now let's just quickly do that. I'm going to do it here on the bottom of the page. So if I had to go and construct a cross-section from C to A, okay, the cross-section would look something like this. And just to represent the river is situated over here next to A. Now, going back to my question, is there a difference in climates of settlement A and C? Most definitely. Okay. Most definitely. The simple reason, because when we look at valley climates, just want to write it down here, we experience different type of breezes during day and during night. During the day, we experience Catabatic breezes. Excuse me, that's anabatic. Anabatic breezes. Absolutely love this question because they're bringing the settlement questions to climate. Now, if we look at during night times, we experience Catabatic breezes. Now, what do we know? Let's just quickly revise on the local climate. Anabatic breezes happens during the day. So what happens during daytime? Obviously, warms up the slopes. What happens? The air starts to rise upslope. Okay. At nighttime, what happens? The land cools much quicker, especially on the slopes because of terrestrial radiation. So what happens during nighttime? We experience downward movement of air, and we call that Catabatic breezes. So definitely, especially during nighttime, A might be prone to frost because it's situated on the bottom of the valley. So that might experience, because that's where we find our frost pocket. So we might experience frost, especially during winter times over there, whereas C won't experience it. Another factor is we have a thermal belt. So obviously, especially during winter times, we experience the inversion inside this valley. Now, what is an inversion? Inversion is an increase of temperature with an increase of altitude. Now, first you were introduced to that in grade 10. Now, it's normal. If we look at it, what is normal? When we go and climb Kilimanjaro, Mount Everest, what's going to happen if we increase with altitude? It's getting colder. Am I correct? It's not like you're going up Kilimanjaro, Mount Everest, and you're going to end up in the bikini on the swimming trunks, right? You're going to be freezing cold because it gets colder the higher we go. Now, what happens with the inversion? Usually when we go higher in altitude, it gets warmer. The simple reason why is because the cold air collects on the bottom of the valley. And what does it do with the warm air? Displaces it up, creating an inversion layer known as a thermal belt. So definitely there's going to be a difference in climate that's going to be experienced at A and at C. Now, very importantly, if you're the farmer at A, especially because you're next to the river as well, you need to keep in mind temperatures might drop below freezing, so we've got a frost pocket, and you need to be able to farm frost-resistant type of crops, very importantly. Okay. Now, if we look at our next question, account for a difference or no difference in climate between A and C. Now, grade 12, I just discussed it with you. The differences between them is because of the different types of breezes we experience during day and night. During day, we experience an anabatic breeze, upslope, and during nighttime, we experience Catabatic, downslope, where the cold air collects in the bottom of it. Okay, if we look at our next question, mention 2 advantages of settlement A and 2 disadvantages of settlement B. Okay. If we go to settlement A, What's the advantage of settlement A? First of all, you can see the farmsteads is dispersed. First of all, immediately, A is definitely a commercial farming, so it means he can make more money. He doesn't need to share his profit, and that's the reason why it's an advantage. He can plant more and he can earn more money. Now, if we look the next question, now keep in mind both of these settlements have advantages and disadvantages. Now, I've just mentioned the advantages A. Now, these questions might be vice versa, but the disadvantage for A, for example, is it might be unsafe, right? Because you are so far from your closest neighbor. Now, if you look at D, for instance, what's the disadvantages that we experience at D? First of all, people need to share their profits. Maybe it's not very viable to be a commercial farming, being nucleated, because the profits needs to be shared. But once again, we do have advantages for nucleated settlements. People may share advice, people may share equipment, and it's a much safer environment with more people living together.